Hello and welcome to the Evolution Exchange, a monthly conversation series from the Society for the Study of Evolution. I'm Regina Baucom, SSE President. Today I'm going to again be talking to Dr. Sam Scheiner, a retired NSF program officer. Today we're going to be talking about writing proposals, NSF proposals, but also just proposals in general. Before we get started, Sam, do you want to give a one-sentence overview of who you are?
Thank you for welcoming me back. And I started out as a plant evolutionary ecologist. I was in academia for 13 years before moving to NSF as a program director in 1998. And then I was 26 years at NSF before retiring a little over a year ago. During my time at NSF, I participated in probably something like 150 review panels and handled thousands of proposals. And in addition, I've also served as a reviewer for agencies in Canada, the UK. I've been on a panel in Chile. In addition, NSF has had partnerships with foreign agencies. I have some familiarity, not just with US review processes, but also those from other places in the world. And a lot of the basics of what makes a good proposal really is true no matter where you're going to submit that proposal.
Awesome. Yeah. So you've seen thousands of proposals in a bunch of different contexts. But let's start just at a basic place about the process. Funding is crucial for early career researchers. What is the first step that an assistant professor or just a junior faculty should take to position themselves for success when it comes to funding?
Trying to make sure you have a successful proposal. The first thing is to make sure that your research aligns with the funding call. In some cases, like submitting to the core programs at NSF, that's open to any topic. In that case, it's the job at NSF to align your interests with the right review panels. But in many other cases, both things at NSF, for example, like the Dimensions of Biodiversity program, or often at other kinds of agencies that might have a much more narrow mission, there's a specific topic that they are interested in you submitting research on, and you want to really be sure that you're not just throwing a proposal at some just because you can. We see that happen all the time, and those just waste everybody's time. Make sure that there is that alignment, and if you're not sure, this goes back to what I said in the previous interview. The single most important bit of advice is contact your program officer or equivalent, the person at the agency who is responsible for that competition, and just ask them, send them a one-paragraph summary of what your research is, and ask, does this align with the funding call?
All right. So fit and communication, basically, is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. In terms of communicating with that program officer, what sort of questions are appropriate to ask that program officer before submitting a proposal?
General fit is fine. They're not going to write your proposal for you, but you can certainly, so they're not going to get down into the weeds of the details unless there may be like a very narrow call where it's like, we want people to address this narrow question X, and then the proposals are really about methods. What method are you going to use versus somebody else, or whether or not you're more competent in using a particular method than somebody else. And so in those cases, yes, you might talk to them about that kind of detail. So it's going to be very context dependent. Otherwise, if you have just questions about what are the rules that you have to follow, that's key, because one of the most important thing is you have to make sure you follow all the rules. Read that either the specific solicitation, or if it's something like an NSF, there's the general proposal guide, submission guide. make sure you understand that and you are following the rules. It's amazing how often we would look at a proposal and said, did they even read the solicitation? It's both the overall fit, but also if there are like specific sections in the proposal that are being asked for. And if it's unclear in what's written, at least unclear to you about what it is that's being asked for, usually the agency people are quite willing to answer questions about, is this exactly what you're looking for? Because again, we don't want to waste everybody's time in having you do something which is just outside the bounds.
Yeah, that's great. So these conversations help clarify fit, process. The guide is extremely informative and quite long, right? And NSF. Before we even start writing a proposal, there's certainly a lot of thinking and informal vetting that people do. Before writing that proposal, how important is it to develop your ideas, bounce them off of collaborators, mentors, colleagues?
Oh, that's really important. And this is actually true for any kind of writing. This is also true for manuscript writing. No matter how good a writer you are, there will always be things that look fine to you on paper, and just other people will look at it and say, what? Even though I've written lots and lots of papers and book chapters and so forth, I still always run all of my manuscripts by at least one other person. And that's doubly important when it comes to grant proposals, because there's maybe a variety of kinds of audiences for a grant proposal, depending upon how the review process works. It could be that proposals are sent to individual reviewers who are going to look at that proposal, or they may go in front of a review panel, or some combination of those two. Again, it very much depends on what the process is at some place. And then among those reviewers, the reviewers might all be narrow specialists in the topic that you're writing, your proposal is going to be about. But it could equally be the case that your proposal is going to go in front of a panel of broad thinkers, no one whom is a real true expert on the narrow topic that you're writing about. And so you have to think about both, are there going to be narrow experts, or there are going to be broad people, or possibly both, that are going to read this proposal. Proposal writing is a little tricky. It's a little bit different from writing a manuscript, because you simultaneously trying to address those two audiences. And when we talk about content, I'll talk a little bit more about how you need to balance that. In terms of getting feedback, you want at least one other person to read what you're doing. And of course, if the proposal is coming from a team of people, you already have an array of people writing it. But it's always still good to get an outside opinion, somebody who's not deeply invested in the topic. And ideally, what you really want is somebody who is at least one person who's an expert, who's going to pick apart that nitty gritty, and then also try to find somebody who is really away from the topic itself to give you feedback on, does this whole thing make sense? And find people who will give you honest opinion, not just oh yeah, this reads fine. I've got friends that I go to who I know they long-term colleagues, but they're really good at really editing me.
Right. Yeah. So true criticism is a kindness, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So it sounds like we want to have a few people read over our proposals. We want to have someone that can dig down into the nitty-gritty. We also want to have some broad perspective. One thing that I did as an assistant professor is I have a sort of a listserv of faculty across a bunch of different fields, not even evolution, but neurobiology, engineering, and we'll read each other's proposals and say, I can't understand the point, to give that really broad feedback. And that might be a little broad, but still, it's helpful. So given that you want to have granular feedback from a variety of places, how far in advance should people be seeking feedback on the proposal? That's
a good question. Let me just broaden that out to talk about timelines and deadlines. So one of the key questions in terms of the rules, is there a deadline, a hard deadline by which a proposal needs to be submitted, or is it maybe a soft deadline, or maybe there are no deadlines at all? If there is a hard deadline, pay attention to that. And then anytime I'm working with a deadline, I always work backwards. I try to have a complete first draft of something that I'm going to give to other people to read 3 to 4 weeks before that deadline, because, they're going to need at least a week usually to be able to get back to you. And then you're going to need time to take care of any revisions. Your institution may have internal deadlines for submission, if not the entire proposal, the budget for review. So you have to pay attention to that. And then, and this is really critical for a deadline, absolutely do not wait until the last day to submit, because who knows what's going to happen. There's a problem with trying to upload the proposal. Your power goes out, your Wi-Fi goes down. We always strongly recommend that you take whatever the hard deadline is and then make in your mind the deadline is 2 days before that. And you submit 2 days before the deadline. That way, if there's any last minute problems, you've got a buffer. And in addition, and again, it's going to depend upon where you're submitting and how their system works. But at NSF, we would tell people, so once you've submitted that document, then download it back and look at the PDF that you think you submitted to make sure it's what you submit. And we've had things submitted like people have managed to upload the Word document that still has the comments.
Oh, no.
Edited it, which lead to very interesting kinds of feedback. Or in cases where you're uploading things in different pieces, we've had instances where like the same piece gets uploaded in 2 different places instead of 2 different pieces. And you don't want all those kinds of things. So you want to be able to look at what you actually have submitted and review it. And again, by doing this a couple of days ahead, then that gives you time to fix any problems. Now, one other thing about what's interesting about deadlines is there's no deadline. What do you do in that case? The biosciences director at NSF went I guess it's now about 5 years ago, went from having deadlines to no deadlines for the core programs. There were still deadlines for special competitions. A very interesting thing happened. There was an 80% drop in the number of submissions when we went to no deadlines. Most people are amazingly driven by deadlines. And without a deadline, they just weren't submitting things. Now, and what we really saw, we still had plenty of stuff at the top end that was perfectly fundable. And what was dropping out were often the tail end, the bottom end of the distribution, things that were submitted that were just sloppy because people were trying to make deadlines and so forth. And an advantage of not having a deadline is you can make sure that your proposal is just as you want it. But on the other hand, if you're one of those people who are driven by deadlines, create your own deadline. Maybe, a big piece of paper on the wall of your office. The deadline is this date. Otherwise, you may never get that proposal submitted.
Yeah. Another reason why it's helpful to have collaborators on proposals. You can give each other deadlines, or even just have a group of friends that hold you to a deadline, right? They're in the same situation. Okay. So once we've developed our ideas, we've pressure tested them, we feel confident. Let's talk about proposal structure, right? I don't know if I'm an odd proposal writer, but I really like good structure, right?
Yeah.
So what does a fundable proposal look like to you structurally?
Okay. Actually, let me back up one step in terms of content before we get into that structure. And this kind of leads into that, which is the first part of the structure is going to be, so what's the big question? And why is that compelling? And so here is a question you can ask yourself, which is when I would talk to people over the phone or by Zoom, one of the first questions I would ask them, let's say you work on some fish, and I would ask that person, okay, so why would somebody who works on plants care about your proposal, or the reverse? Whatever it is they would work on I would pick some very distant kind of organism and say, why is this compelling to somebody who is not an expert in what you do? Because everybody thinks that their research is the most important. And of course, everybody else in the world is going to be excited about it. But that's not the case. And you have to be clear about what is the broad question that you're ultimately going to address and why that's compelling to a lot of people. Now, in evolutionary biology, where we're always simultaneously both working on a specific question and addressing that big, broader question. And so you always want to keep that in mind. And so now to get back to structure, so the first part of the proposal should be the first page, let's say, and it depends on how many how much space you have, is what is that big question and why is it interesting? What is the sort of the broad domain that it addresses? And it doesn't have to address everything in evolutionary biology because nothing ever is going to. But is it something beyond the specific system? How is this addressing something beyond just incrementally advancing what you know about your particular organism? And this is where what I said earlier about who the audience is matters, because the generalists, that's where you really have to hook them, right? The specialists, though, they already are interested in this particular topic, but the more general reader, they are not. You're going to have to convince them here that it is. But on the other hand, don't try to oversell, because we would get these proposals and this is the most novel idea since Darwin, and clearly, and people are going to read that and they're just going to shake their heads. And so be honest about where you are in terms of the state of current knowledge. Now, it could be that you are stepping into a set of organisms or an arena, a set of questions which really has not been addressed at all in the past. And yes, this truly is something novel. Much more likely, of course, is there's at least some prior work in this area, but it could very well be that maybe this phenomenon you're looking at has only been demonstrated once, and we have no idea. Do other kinds of organisms have the same phenomenon, especially if, okay, it was demonstrated in an insect, and now I'm going to look at a mammal. And it's important to know that both insects and mammals have these kinds of behaviors or this kind of molecular structure or whatever. And it's perfectly okay that maybe this is not even the second, but the third or fourth, because as in lots of evolutionary biology, right, the answer isn't yes, no. The answer is what's the relative importance. And that only happens with several different case studies. If it's the 25th, then that really becomes your incremental and then may not be interesting. So what is new about what you're doing? Is it the first time or maybe only the second time, or is it's only been demonstrated in this one clade, and now you're going to look at it in a completely different clade and demonstrate that it's either the evolutionary roots are much deeper than we might have thought, or this is something that has evolved multiple times, and it's important to understand that. And so you want to provide that context and do it in an honest fashion. Don't oversell what you're doing, but then don't undersell it either.
That seems like a hard line to walk.
Yes. Yeah. I would say the underselling is where you simply assume that they know this is exciting.
Okay. And so is that line a good question for a PO?
Yes, you could ask that. That's also where your other colleagues, especially the ones that are not experts in this area, that they can tell you. But yes, definitely ask you. Although usually I would try to get them to articulate it, and because I'm not an expert in that particular topic either. And my job as a program officer was to figure out how to get them to articulate that. And often we'd be in conversations and I'd say, yes, write that down. That's exactly what you need to say in your proposal.
That's great. Yeah. First page, big, broad idea, vetted. What comes after that?
Okay. So you've got the big question. Then what are the specific questions you're going to ask within the context of your proposal? And this is where people often make a big mistake, because those specific questions, this is often where people are putting forth the hypotheses, the more specific hypotheses they're going to test. And so many proposals, those are just straw man hypotheses, often framed as the null is nothing's going to happen versus something will happen. And you read that, and of course, we already know the answer. Yes, of course, something is going to happen. To the extent that you're putting forth hypotheses, you want to try to make them quantitative. They could be qualitative in the sense of a positive response versus a negative response, but that's still at least distinctive. You're putting forth alternatives. And this is where, rather than just a null versus a hypothesis, what you really want is true alternative potential outcomes. This is often best if there's an actual disagreement in the literature about whether or not things are likely to be true. Going back to old days, like sexual selection, right? Was it a Scheinian runaway process versus a good genes process? And so there were true alternatives that people were looking at. And those, of course, make really the most compelling proposals, where you have true alternatives. On the other hand, it is perfectly okay not to have any hypotheses. It's all perfectly okay to frame this as exploratory and, in a sense, a hypothesis generation type of situation, especially if you're going into a novel kind of area where very little is known. There's still the big picture of there are these various kinds of possible alternatives, or we don't know if something exists or not. But then be honest, say, here's the question. There isn't a hypothesis, but I'm going to show you how I'm going to design this study in a way that will actually truly advance what we don't know about this current situation. So don't just make people think that they have to have a hypothesis. No, you don't. But then you have to clearly frame a question that you are going to answer.
Yeah. It seems like, to me, certain panels might be more open to non-hypothesis or hypothesis generating types of proposals. Do you think that's right?
What I would say is most panels it depends on what you mean by a hypothesis, because the hypothesis, you have hypotheses at various different levels, right? So there are hypotheses having to do with, if I run this experiment, here is the outcome that I expect, and which is going to be tested using this statistical procedure. That's a hypothesis, right? You've got a particular outcome in a statistical procedure you're going to test against. And I would say the vast majority of the time, you're going to at least have that, unless you're talking about a project which is, we're going to do a biodiversity survey in some part of the world that hasn't been well surveyed, and then it's just a description. On the other hand, you could have a proposal which is methods development. So there are whole other classes of kinds of proposals. I'm going to be developing this new method. There's no hypotheses at all, right? It's a lot of theory proposals. Those aren't about testing hypotheses. They're about developing a new theoretical model and seeing how something may play out. So I would say, again, it's going to be very context dependent. This is where getting advice from people who have been funded through a particular review panel or program, they could give you feedback. Although you do have to be a little careful asking your colleagues. Now, if they've served on panels, that's good. But if they've only been funded, especially if they've not been funded, everybody is always convinced when they don't get funded, it's because obviously the panel was prejudiced against my kind of proposal rather than, actually I wrote a bad proposal. But getting feedback from people who have been reviewers and have been on panels is useful, because they can, especially if they're experienced and they've reviewed a lot of proposals or been on multiple panels, they can really give you a sense of how critical particular components are versus not.
Yeah. And I think that leads us to my sort of next question. So when I've served on panels, there have clearly been these proposals that are just zingers, right? They just rise to the top and everyone's really excited about them. They're few, but how would a person take a proposal from good to that level of competitive to write a zinger?
Yeah. Okay. So now we get into what really makes a good proposal. You've set up the big question and then the more specific questions. So, what do you want to have in the details? So, the first question, and a very frequent question that we always got was, how much preliminary data do I need to have? Because people think, oh, I need to have the project half done before it's going to get funded. And I'm not going to speak to other agencies, but certainly at NSF, that wasn't the case, because if it's half done, it's okay, you've mostly done the work. Why do we need to give you more money when we have projects that have nothing? But preliminary data is important in one of two ways. The first, is there a phenomenon of interest here? So if, let's say, you're going to study differentiation across a bunch of different populations of some phenomenon, it's really useful to have at least some preliminary data saying, yes, there's at least some differences among populations. And you're not going to go out there and there's just genetic uniformity and the whole project dies. Now, you don't need to demonstrate statistical significance in those patterns. In fact, that's often what the proposal is then going to do, is it's going to provide you enough funds now to go back and provide either statistical significance or, okay, you've sampled 3 populations, you've demonstrated that there's at least some variability out there, and now I can go out and do the 10 populations that you really need to do to answer this question. But so there's that. Now, it could be, though, that you're dealing with a topic in which there's a whole literature on this phenomenon, and you're going to address it in a new way or something. You don't need preliminary data in that case. You can just lean on the literature. Then the other part where preliminary data is important is to demonstrate feasibility. And there's a couple of different issues here. One is, this is less true than it was a couple of decades ago, now that search sequencing is becoming just routine. But there are some kinds of systems like highly polyploid systems, for example, where it might be difficult to get sequence data out, and having some preliminary data showing feasibility. Or if you're using some brand new cutting edge methodology, technology, then some preliminary data showing that either the technology itself works or that how to use this brand new technology, that's the other place that some preliminary data is important. So is there a phenomenon, and then are the methods going to be feasible?
Yeah.
Then,
yeah, do you mind if
sorry, go ahead.
I jump in question there?
Yeah.
I wonder if this is a case where preprints could be helpful for people. So let's say they've developed a novel technique and they need to show feasibility, but to show that they actually have it working in a grant would take up a lot of landscape of that grant. So let's say maybe they write up the paper, it hasn't had time to go through the process, but putting it onto bioRxiv seems like a reasonable solution to me. How have reviewers responded to that?
So never assume that a reviewer is going to look at anything other than what's actually in the proposal. Now, that said, having something up on bioRxiv that you can reference, that's still then a citable source, that's always real useful, especially when it comes to feasibility. Okay, yes, this person has at least produced some manuscripts, maybe published papers, but even if they're not published, if you're putting a paper up on bioRxiv, usually that means, okay, you're comfortable with the technique. But if there's some critical piece of information, maybe a critical figure, graph or photograph or anything like that, put it in the proposal. And this is, of course, where a picture is worth 1,000 words. So sometimes you just have to have that one graph and the caption and then the reference to other papers. So you don't need to take up a lot of space, but if it's that critical, definitely put it in the proposal. Don't just assume that they're going to go look at your papers published elsewhere.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. So do you have any other advice from going from good to competitive?
Yeah. So then, okay, so you've got the big picture, the specific hypotheses, you've laid out the preliminary data. That may also, the preliminary data may be actually in the intro, big part of it depends on the feasibility stuff. Maybe you don't necessarily put that in the front, but following the hypotheses, once you start in on the methods, here's what we're going to do. Then what you want to do is have very clear laying out of the steps that you're going to go through. My old postdoc advisor would say, the reader should be able to see in their mind's eye you walking around your lab doing the work. Whether or not you need that level of detail, again, it's really going to depend on the specifics of what you have to do. Of course, also the total amount of space that you have matters. Sometimes, often less is more. You want to make the proposal as readable as possible, which means numbered sections with bolded headers, so it's clear as you're stepping through so that the reviewer can follow. You want a clear outline. How much detail you need to provide when it comes to methodology. Again, it's going to depend. If this is an off-the-shelf kind of procedure we no longer bother to provide details about how we're going to do our DNA extraction. That's now become just so routine. We don't need to provide the details, although you want to write the thing at least in such a way that it's clear to the reader that you know what you're doing. And again, this often was when people would try to convince the reviewer that they're going to use the most cutting edge technology and they've never done it before. Yeah. And it would be really clear. So it's a bit of a balancing act in terms of how much detail you need to provide given the total amount of space that you have available. Then when you're providing those details of the methods, here is something which I've seen very rarely, but if you do it and do it well, it can be really valuable, which is, okay, here's how I am going to design this experiment. But there are other ways you might have designed it. One of the best proposals ever saw, it was co-reviewed and ended up with 10 or 12 reviews, all of which were excellent. Mm-hmm. What they did is for every part in the methods, because it was several different kinds of experiments, they would say, here's what we're doing. And then they would have a paragraph, which would be, here's the alternative way, or possibly two ways that you might have designed this experiment. And here's why we didn't use that method. We used the one we did. And I can still remember there was a panelist that said, there were places where I disagreed with the author, the PIs of this proposal, but they clearly had thought this through, and they had presented why they were going with their alternative. And so that was that. I was willing to go with them. Because if you don't do that, then of course the reviewer is going to say, why didn't they do X or do Y? And that's going to become a reason for them to then score it lower. You want to anticipate objections, counter-arguments, alternative methods, and address them you don't need to take up a lot of space. And again, the extent you need to do that depends on possible disagreements. But it could be like something, for example, there's always trade-offs. For example, let's say you're doing sampling across population. It's going to be trade-offs of numbers of population sample versus numbers of individuals within a population. And there may be good statistical reasons or reasons related to the question you're asking as to whether or not you more populations and fewer individuals within a population or vice versa. And those are the kinds of things where, first of all, it forces you to think through the alternatives, but it also then makes clear to the reviewer why you've designed things the way you want to. So you've done that. And then the last part of it, and this is where, again, a lot of proposals fail to do this, is what I call completing the circle, which is, okay, you've provided the big picture, the specific questions, hypotheses, the methods. Now, what are you going to do with those data, and how are you going to relate them back to not just the specific questions, but the big questions. So
Okay.
very often proposals do not really talk about how they are going to not just analyze the data using this particular statistical technique, but how are they going to interpret those results? So if you see one particular pattern versus another, how does that relate to the big questions? And in particular, if you're going to be collecting more than one kind of data, assume that the outcome is going to be messy, right? How are you going to interpret things if some of the data goes one direction and other parts of the data go a different direction? And no, everybody always pretends as if everything is always going to be all nice and clean at the end. And it's also perfectly okay if the result is going to be messy, because then that sets the stage for what the next set of experiments are going to be. But you always want to close that loop, really talk about how you're going to interpret the data in terms of how that's going to advance that big question that you set up at the top.
Is this where I have a colleague who always uses conceptual diagrams, right? Masterfully. Is this where conceptual diagram would be helpful?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. For many years, I ran a program called Ecology and Evolution of Infectious Diseases, and those were big, complicated kinds of projects. And they almost always would have a mathematical model as well as an empirical component. And my advice for those proposals, and this also helps in general, is first of all, yes, a conceptual diagram with all of the pieces of what you're going to do, that you want that up front. Because first of all, some people are visual learners versus do better readers. So again, you want to anticipate the fact that different kind of people are going to take in information in different ways. Having that big diagram is always really important, because it helps in terms of how the pieces are going to fit together. Again, you might have a table if you're going to have a variety of different kinds of data that, let's say, are going to address two different alternatives. It's useful to have a summary table that says, for experiment 1, outcome X, we should see a positive response, and outcome Y should be a negative response. For the second set of data, it should be this kind of response versus the other. In some cases, it's not any single experiment which is definitive, but it's the sum total of all those patterns, and having a diagram and or table in some fashion that summarizes that is always very useful.
Do you think reviewers focus most on that first page versus the other components of the grant? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how important really is that first page and the hook page?
Yeah, that first page is absolutely critical. Setting up the big question and the overall approach that you're going to take is very important, because certainly the non-experts, you're going to lose them right there if you haven't at least made this at least somewhat compelling at the very beginning. But even the experts, they're going to read that and say, does this person really have a good clue as to how to address this research, or do they really understand what the big picture is that their research is going to fit inside?
Yeah, and when I'm on panel, we read 10, 12 proposals about, and I think you want to give your reviewer that's going to fight for you and really get behind your proposal a condensed place to read back, to remind themselves when, they're stepping into that, I don't want to say arena, because it's a little dramatic, but when they're going back to the panel, they need to refresh their thought.
Yeah. And one thing you can do, for example, in that conceptual diagram, you've got numbered sections. You can say, put a little tag in there saying section 3.2 or section 5. And that, again, provides a roadmap for the reader to make it easier for them as they go through the proposal, if they want to then see, okay, where does this particular piece fit in the big picture? They can immediately go back to that conceptual diagram and say, oh, the section I'm reading here, that refers to this part of the overall picture.
And we've talked about the first page, the going from good to competitive, how to structure your grant. Let's talk a little bit about significance. So where do applicants fall short when trying to articulate the significance of their problem?
So that again, that's that big picture. What's the domain that you're addressing? And again, this is where don't try to oversell. Be honest about, who this applies to. And okay, this might be important for understanding all of bacteria, and that's fine. It doesn't have anything to do with archaea or eukaryotes, but this is really going to tell us something important about bacteria. Now, those are for when you're applying for fundamental research kinds of things. On the other hand, if this is a more applied proposal, call for proposals, then significance might be economic, or it could be health related. And like for the EID program, what we always said was the ideal proposal, both simultaneously, is going to solve a particular health problem in a particular place, as well as then providing some more general understanding of how infectious diseases might propagate that is applicable to other kinds of systems. Again, it's very much going to depend upon the particular call that you're responding to. In some cases, yes, significance is really easy. We're looking for proposals on malaria, and you could just have a couple sentences. Yes, malaria infects millions of people every year. Here's the morbidity and mortality burden, and we're going to do something about that, as opposed to what might go to something in NSF, where you're really just advancing evolutionary concepts and theories more generally. And then again, is this something which is clade specific, or is it something broader than that?
Great. When a person is submitting their best, how can a person ensure that they're going to be submitting their best proposal? If you were to give them a single piece of important advice, what would that be? Kind of distill everything down to a single most important piece of advice.
So the most important piece of advice is, I think, get feedback from others before, because again, first of all, you always think that your own research is the most important thing out there. And two, you don't necessarily recognize issues in your own writing where you fail to provide details that you should have provided.
Yeah. I guess with that, in a sort of closing sentiment, closing reflection, we've talked about single most important advice. We've talked about content. We've talked about structure. A couple more things to think about would be broader impacts. So having significant, interesting, compelling, right, broader impacts. And then moving on from there, also thinking about your audience. You mentioned earlier that you might have a variety of different audience types. It could be a panel. It could be just a couple of people. So I want to hit on those two things before we wrap up. So one would be broader impacts, and then again, zooming out and thinking about having a variety of people that will be reading your proposal, whether it's a panel or it's a smaller structure.
Yeah, so broader impacts, that's a little bit of NSF jargon, but for those of you who may not have applied NSF, these are the potential effects of the research project that go beyond the research itself, training postdocs, graduate students, undergraduates, how the research might be used by public health officials or the general public, involving citizen scientists, all those kinds of things. NSF, that's a required part of the proposals. Other kinds of countries, so in the UK, for example, they have a required section on societal impacts. Mm-hmm. And again, it's going to be context dependent in terms of whether or not you're required to have a section like that and what they're looking for. So this is, again, where you want to read the solicitation or the general rules, or just have a sense of what that funding agency requires. Other kinds of things you want to make sure you pay attention to are like data management. How are you going to manage your data, and are you required to submit it to public databases? Yeah. For example, you want to pay attention to all of those kinds of details. And again, make sure that you're writing to the particular agency that when you address those kinds of issues.
That's great. Awesome. Sam, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking us through proposal writing and both the broad aspects as well as the more specific nitty-gritty. And thanks again for talking to us last time and talking about NSF more broadly. I just really appreciate all the time that you've spent with us. So thank you.
My pleasure. Always glad to help out.